As I said before, my name is Kelly Goff. I stand for gender equality, but I also stand for educational equality. And so does our entire fabulous panel that's seated behind me. Ian Rowe. Ian, raise your hand. This is Ian. Ian Rowe is the CEO and founder of the groundbreaking, change-making charter school pioneer, Public Prep, which you got some love in the room, Ian. And Jacob Lief is the founder of the Ubuntu Education Fund in South Africa, which is making sure that children who may not have had access to educational opportunities do now, and he'll tell you more about it. And they will be interviewed by my fellow NPR family member, Anya Kamenentz. Let's give a warm welcome, and I do mean warm, so I want to hear a lot of applause. There'll be a prize for whichever panel gets the most applause. It's not true, but we're going to pretend it's true. Let's give a really, really warm welcome to Ian, Jacob, and Anya. Woo!
Thank you all for agreeing to be with us on this beautiful, beautiful October afternoon. I'm really thrilled to be invited to take part in this conversation. As Kelly mentioned, I cover education for NPR, and I cover it as an author. And I'm part of the group of cheerleaders who tries to make space for conversations around education anywhere and everywhere. So I was thrilled to be invited to be part of this incredibly ambitious program and festival. And I'm going to ask each of my panelists now to speak just a little bit more in detail about the work that they do and the theory of change behind the work that they do, right? So theory of change meaning, how is what you're going to do going to change the world? No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me? Yes? Yes?
Louder.
Louder. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. This is a fantastic opportunity to speak about our schools and the importance of education. My name is Ian Rowe. I'm the CEO of Public Prep, which is a nonprofit network of single-gender public charter schools in New York City. And if you remember nothing else from this discussion, I think I stand for the power of a parent, regardless of their race, income level, or zip code, to have the power to choose a great public school for their child. In New York City, back in 2005, if you were a parent that not only wanted a great tuition-free education for your daughter, if you wanted your daughter to have a single-sex education, that option didn't exist. And so in 2005, we started Girls Prep, which was the first and only all-girls public charter school in New York. We've since grown. We now have 1,800 students across 5 campuses in the Lower East Side and the Bronx. And we serve almost exclusively communities that have very high levels of poverty. And we serve almost exclusively children from Black and Hispanic backgrounds. And ultimately, we want to put all of our students on a path to college completion. I'm really excited to have this conversation here. We're in the midst of a presidential election, and we have a society that's dramatically changing, whether it be all the opportunities that are being created, whether it's artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, all of the vast, amazing technologies that are going to transform our culture and world. We're not really hearing a lot about how these seismic shifts should affect the education that we're providing to our children. And so I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Ian.
All right. My name is Jacob Lief. I'm CEO and founder of Ubuntu Education Fund. And like Ian, I stand for the idea that your birthplace shouldn't have to determine your future. About 19 years ago, I found myself in the townships on the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Nelson Mandela was telling the country, apartheid's over, the youth, you can all access university. Meanwhile, big philanthropy, big foundations, names you all know, money's pouring into post-apartheid South Africa. And everyone's defining success by how many cups of soup they hand out, how many wind-up computers they give out. And I'll tell you, none of you got to where you are by a wind-up computer and a cup of soup. And I'm looking at these little girls sitting in shacks who've been raped, who are being raised by parents who are 15 years old, 16 years old, who don't have an education themselves, And I'm thinking, none of this reconciles. There's no way these kids are going to make it to university. And I thought about how much was invested in my upbringing. And it was not a one-off solution. It was every day of my life. And it still happens. I was lucky to be raised in a two-parent home. And I like to say it's probably harder for me to have failed in life than succeeded. And so we started Ubuntu basically to help these young girls, and we decided to take grade 8 students who had been raped or who lost their parents, so the bottom of the bottom. And I want to prove that if we invested in them the same way someone invested in me, we could get them out. The truth was grade 8 was too late in the game, and we started working our way back over the last 18 years to where we got to today. And in most of the world, parenting begins when a child's born. And the truth is it begins in the first trimester, as you know, right? I mean, you're dealing with all this now, you're going to doctors, you're seeing all this. And so we today start with HIV positive pregnant mothers, and we ensure a healthy birth. And then we work with the mother and child, and hopefully the father, every day of their lives. And that's true sustainability. And we like to say we give our kids really what kids all around the world deserve, and that's everything.
Well, are you guys hearing us okay? It's very echoey from where I am. I don't know if there's a way to, it sounds all right to you? Okay, we'll speak slowly and clearly. So, I was reflecting on the fact that they chose to include education in this sort of brief program and wondering, I mean, of course, as people who work with education, you never feel that it's getting enough attention. But I did want to ask each of you if you feel like in the age of Malala that education is getting closer to taking up the amount of attention and time that it really deserves. And if not, then how do you make that case to donors, to change makers, that this is something that really deserves top of mind attention, along with terrorism, along with disease, along with poverty?
So for me, education does not nearly receive the attention it deserves. Again, we're in the midst of a presidential election. When you think of the debates, I really cannot think of a moment when either Trump nor Clinton have directly focused on what should be the education for the next generation to prepare them for a world that will have such vastly different opportunities because of particularly technology changes. And there's so many connections to other issues that are deemed important. So if you're really focused on terrorism, in most countries in which terrorism is flourishing, you usually have failed education systems, largely of young men that are not being educated and are able to be influenced in other ways. If you're interested in economic growth, the United States, we are not graduating the same numbers of engineers, scientists that China and India, other countries that are making vast improvements in their economies. I mean, China is growing at a 7% GDP increase year to year. The United States, we're still hovering 1 to 2%. So education is sort of the foundational element that connects to so many other issues that are getting more reactionary attention now. And so we certainly would advocate that public education in particular needs to be a central part of our discussion.
Just to add on to it, I mean, we work in very different areas, but the approach that we're both sharing is the same, and it's based on quality. And it's not just about funding education, but doing it the right way, doing it the same way you'd want to invest in your own children, your own families, across into disadvantaged settings, whether it's the South Bronx or South Africa. And the number one question when I'm raising money, actually right in this area, is, well, how dare you spend $3,000 per child in South Africa? Meanwhile, this hedge fund manager sent their child to $50,000 a year elementary school, and that's okay. And these are the good people I'm dealing with. These aren't the Koch brothers. These are the good guys. And we're trying to remind people that
they're saying that you're spending too much. This is profligate.
People are saying, well, and it's always about how do you reach more kids for less money. But I have two boys of my own, and I've never once asked that. I mean, we're always trying to save money. Don't get me wrong; it's expensive and run a nonprofit. But we're always saying, what's the best healthcare we can provide for our children? What's the best education we can provide? And I think we have to really, and we also understand that education is one small part of it. We found there's no point investing in a child in math and science, or if they're going home every day and they're being abused, or there's no roof over their head, And it's really that comprehensive approach that I think community institutions, whether they're schools or community centers like ours, need to take.
Wonderful. And I think building on that, when you and I talked earlier, and I think this is probably on my mind for all kinds of reasons, how did you become convinced that, you talked so much about the idea that, starting with the children that you met and then realizing you had to go back to their very young childhood and then even back to prenatally to their mothers, right? To really create a cradle to career trajectory for them. And so how did you become so convinced of that? And can you apply it to kind of the broader conversation that's going on around preschool? And I'm going to bring that to you as well, Ian.
So as I said earlier, we started with grade 8 students, and our kids, the schools we work in are absolutely terrible. Our kids were already at a 4th grade reading level, and they're supposed to be in grade 8. And we did this research initiative to prove that for every year a child in our area spends in a public school, they're actually only gaining a half a year. So, they're losing their education. And I was having one of these days where I just wanted to pull all my hair out and just quit. And a guy who's a big mentor of mine, this guy Jeff Cannon up in Harlem here, Harlem Children's Zone, an incredible model. I think it is, at least. It's controversial, I guess, to some. He said to me, I want to show you something. And he brings me to his clinic. And I'm like, oh, this is your clinic. Are these your high school kids? And he said, no, these are my mothers. These are our pregnant mothers. And they were all high school kids. And he said, and he looks at me and goes, 25 years in, how many kids do you think I've put into university? And I said, I don't know. And he goes, 340. After 25 years. And my face, he said, yep, your face is just like everyone else's. And he's like, we're trying to break generational poverty, and you have to start with pregnant mothers. And that's where it begins. And that was the beginning of our journey to look into it. And we adapted a lot of our model off of what they're doing uptown here. And ensuring a healthy birth, making sure the mother is healthy, and hoping to have a father engaged as well. I'll tell you an interesting story. When we built our own pediatric health clinic in 2009, Philips, which is they make medical supplies, offered us a new ultrasound machine, a $250,000 machine, a machine that my board would never have approved us buying. And I didn't even think anything of it. And we often talk about behavior change in our business and how hard that is, and how we all know certain things, and we have a lot of knowledge over issues, but do we actually change because of that knowledge? And what we found is being able to show a mother and hopefully a father in the first trimester an image of their baby, which no one in our region was able to do, it allowed us to begin talking about parenting in the first trimester. And in 18 years of running this organization, there are very few opportunities that we see in what we call windows of opportunity for behavior change, and this was one of them. And getting that mother to say, oh my God, that little image, I have to start parenting now. What goes into my body affects that child. I have to start setting my future up. And it's not that great of an innovation. I'm always asked to speak on our great innovation. There's no innovation, it's an old recipe. I gave a talk in my old high school, and I asked all these 16, 17-year-olds to start off the assembly. I said, take a piece of paper and write, how do you raise a child? I didn't say if it was a baby or a teenager. I said, how do you raise a child? And they all wrote things down. I collected a paper after 3 minutes. I started reading randoms. You feed them, you teach, you hug them. These are things we know. So why can't we apply that same discipline that we apply to our own children or in a privileged setting and into some really hard areas and provide the support network? And
I mean, the paradigm shift you're talking about is actually incredibly deep. It's civilization-wide, because when you go from a society where children are many and early life is very hard to sustain, to the Western model of this incredible investment in each child. I mean, that's an economic shift, it's a shift, a cultural shift, it's a conceptual shift. The science of it is one part, but getting people to have the hope.
Why do major foundations that we all know who sit around here still ask what our exit strategy is? You have a 5-year-old, there's no exit strategy raising kids.
Right.
You're with them every day of their lives, and that's sustainability.
Yeah.
Yet we think of, I don't know, I think actually a lot of the problems lay in the dynamics between the funders and the organizations. And there's huge imbalance there. There's a lot of, none of it makes sense. It's something we really have to start to address, that relationship, and really start to look at it as more of a partnership and allow organizations to fail and to acknowledge how hard this work is. The environments we work in are incredibly complex. And I've never been to a conference where organizations were allowed to stand up and talk about their challenges or their failures. And if we were doing half of what we said we'd be doing, there'd be no poverty in the world. And that's the truth.
So Ian, you expanded into pre-K in 2014, and you're part of this paradigm shift here in the United States.
Yes. So before I became CEO of Public Prep, I was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in an area of the foundation called Post-Secondary Success. And the Post-Secondary Success team was focused on how do we have more low-income young people graduate from college. And we made significant investments. We gave away about $480 million to community colleges, to high schools, really trying to help these institutions better remediate kids that were coming into college reading maybe at 7th grade reading levels or 6th grade reading levels. And it just became so clear that many of our investments were coming in way too late to make a real difference in the lives of young people. So I wanted to run a network of schools that did start earlier. So when I became Public Prep, CEO of Public Prep, which is a network of now pre-K, elementary, and middle schools, we have this philosophy which is to start early with the end in mind. And for us, the end in mind is college completion, but you've got to start from pre-K. And frankly, if I could get to our students even earlier, I would. Right now, I get them at 4 years old, but it's extraordinary. Even at 4 years old, the language deficits, the vocabulary deficits that we're seeing that we already have to make up for is a significant part of the education that we need to provide. So we actually started pre-K in partnership with Sesame Workshop, principally for this reason. And in many communities, in middle and upper class communities, children from the very beginning are being exposed to words, to the world, to museums, to a mindset. We start in pre-K, we open up what are called New York State 529 college savings accounts for all of our students, and we match those because we want parents to be in the mindset, even from 4 years old, that 12 years later, you're preparing now for this idea for college. And we find so much of our education is not just for the kids, but it is for the parents who we have to help acclimate new kinds of expectations that might be very different than the life they've led, but we have to set expectations for their child.
We also work with Sesame to help. They helped us develop our whole early childhood program. But we take our 3-year-olds, and I use that phrase, should your birthplace determine your future? And we ask them each what they want to be. And it's the same thing that any of your kids might be, firemen, policemen, whatever it might be. But we take pictures of them standing in front of their homes, which are shacks. And we take these pictures and put them around our center so these kids can remember that these kids can dream just like everyone else. And a part of achieving those dreams is having a caregiver involved. And really, if unless a caregiver is involved, we will not accept that student. We cannot continue working with that student because we just found at that young age, we can't have the impact we want to have. And maybe you could argue that those kids need it the most, and it can be an older sibling, it can be an aunt, an uncle, it can be anybody, but they need to be there involved. And like you said, they need to be able to open the book, even if they can't read, and point to the pictures and be part of that child's journey, because there's only so much we can do.
It's a very controversial point because we in the education reform world, I think, are sometimes hesitant to say what are the limitations for what a school can achieve depending on what is happening in the home of a given child. I mean, in the United States, again, we serve primarily Black and Hispanic low-income families. Today, about 70% of all Black children in the United States are born out of wedlock, right? And actually across all race, across all income level, it's about 4 in 10. And so part of the challenge we face is how much can education make up for what happens if you're living in a community with widespread fatherlessness or caregivers. And so it's controversial because some people don't because we sometimes talk about this idea of what's called a success sequence. And a success sequence, pretty simple. It's the first thing you do in your life is you get a good education and you graduate from college. Then you get a job, then you get married, and then you have a child, in that order. But there's a lot of controversy over talking to kids about that because it may be seen as moralizing or judging families that didn't make those decisions. But when we think about the next generation and helping them make the choices that we think are likely going to have better outcomes for themselves and their kids, those are the kinds of things I think schools are now grappling with and what role we should play.
Well, I mean, and I wonder, I've been looking into research recently, only, even in the best cases, children spend about 20% of their time in school, right? And so can you turn that around a little bit and think about the whole community being your clients and think about capacity building amongst the families that you work with? Because what I think research is starting to show us with Head Start and other programs is that parents are able to step up and caregivers are able to step up and even community members. I mean, on NPR, we ran a story last week about a barber in Ypsilanti, Michigan, who gives a $2 discount to kids if you read a book to him while he's cutting the kid's hair. And it was just unbelievable, right? Response. People are so amazed by this idea. Because that barber sees himself as a role model. He's African American, he's cutting a lot of African American kids' hair. And if that's gonna get somebody else in their life who cares that they're reading, that's important. And we have our bus drivers, we have our custodial workers, we have so many people that work in schools, outside of schools. So, I mean, how do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think that's a great story. I mean, one of the challenges is as much as that barber is helping those individual children that come into his barbershop, it can never replace the daily interaction with the two people that brought that child into the world. Of course. And that's the thing. How do we make up for the challenges in our families, in particular in the United States? Because I think there's lots of people who are wanting to do those things, but it's just very difficult to compensate for what's happening, especially in communities where you particularly have a lot of absent fathers, and what the consequence of that is. And honestly, I think we as a society need to be more open to talking about what the consequences of that family disintegration.
I mean, our communities are, there are very few fathers living with the children that we work with, and the mother's number one priority is to get food on that table. And, for us to sit there and say, you have to open a book every night, you have to do that, it's hard, but we've also realized that we've built what we think is a formula out of poverty. We can prove it after 18 years. We've got kids. And part of this formula is that engaged parent, and we're very, very tough on these parents. I'm a sucker. My staff is incredibly tough. No, but it's true, and I bought into it. It took me a long time to buy into it. But it's the only way we've been able to break out and to say, no, these are our rules. And part of it is applying the same standards that are applied, I think, in privileged communities. And let me tell you, our mothers love their children just as much as any other mother in the world. They care just as much, except they have to try to scramble for food. They didn't have a chance for an education. They have everything stacked against them. And so what we're trying to do is, yes, is to provide the support network and remind them that even when their kids they make mistakes, we're still there for them, which is a key. And to also provide them help provide that path, but it's a partnership. It's not us saying this is the way you have to do it. You have to sign up and come, and no, we're not holding you. They sign a contract, and this is an agreement of what both sides are going to contribute to this child.
Absolutely. I'm going to bring in Antigone here, and don't be, Antigone, who the festival is about. And I was just reading over the play on the way over here, and this is just an incredible story of a woman who has been through so much trauma and yet becomes an avatar of conviction. And at one point she says to her sister, I owe a longer allegiance to the dead than to the living, because in that world I will abide forever. And I really see that as a version of like Martin Luther's statement, here I stand, I can do no other, right? Because her commitment is not just to the world of the dead, but she sees it as a living thing, that it's the time horizon that she's working on is longer, and therefore she's willing to stand up with conviction because she sees a longer scale future. She'll have one set of judgment in this world, but a different set of judgment. And whether or not we take a religious stance on that, I wonder about how you each talk to your kids. I mean, you guys are oriented toward service transformation. The students that you work with you're trying to bring them up. But I imagine there's a dimension to that as well, where you're also trying to empower them to be change makers. So I want to hear from both of you about that.
Well, the very fact that you're talking about Antigone, if you look even at the curriculum in most urban schools across the country, they're not teaching the classics in this way. And sometimes the rationale, oh, we can't teach Antigone because this is some historical figure, we're right in the heart of the South Bronx, there'll be no connection. And so therefore, this idea of the canon is sometimes rejected. And so one of the things we try to do actually is expose our kids to all of these incredible young women, young men who they may have never heard of, and yet they can see seeds of themselves in these stories. And they can see the trauma that Antigone has experienced and relate that to maybe what they have faced in their own life and gain a sense of courage that maybe I can overcome this too. And so a lot of that is just, what are the decisions by the adults who are creating the expectations for what kids can achieve? Because sometimes it's the self-limiting beliefs of the adults that traps kids in the community's environments that they're in.
So our end goal at the end of the day, it's a long journey with our children, but it's what we call stable health, stable income. Are you supporting your family, whether you're a factory worker or a teacher or a charter accountant, whatever it is, and good citizenship. And this idea of citizenship is something I think is missing a lot. How do you not just take, but however you define your community, whether it's your family, your religious community, your school community, but how do you give back and be part of something? And it really speaks to the core of what the word Ubuntu means, this idea that I am because you are. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's our patron of our organization, someone who's had a profound impact on me personally and our organization, always, when defining the word Ubuntu, says a person is a person through a person. Meaning doesn't matter your race, your politics, your religion, but as human beings, we're defined how we treat each other. And so we've really built that into sort of every aspect of what we did. Now, I arrived in South Africa in '94 as a part of the Free South Africa movement. I was 17 to observe the elections and the transition. And I had this idea, I got to be culturally sensitive. 3-4 years later, I start this organization and this idea of being culturally sensitive. And one thing I've learned over the last 18 years is that basic human rights or child's rights always trump culture. It was culturally appropriate to have slaves in this country at one point. Doesn't mean it's right. And I say that because it's probably the biggest lesson I've taken away of my journey so far is that basic human rights, I've heard culture used to define the worst aspects of humanity. And at the end of the day, there's a certain way you treat people and there's a certain way you should act. And I think it speaks to what this conference is actually all about and what we should stand for. And that's a certain set of sort of human values. And I mean,
that's so close to the heart of the message of the play, right? Because Antigone is flouting the rule of law and her sister appeals to the rule of law. And she says, I don't listen to the rule of law, I listen to this higher power. And so I have no doubts about what I'm doing. And that's what you're talking about too. There's an ultimate standard that's beyond particular cultures or particular places. Talking about the past, ancient past, let's turn a little bit to the future. I was really intrigued by what you were saying in the beginning, Ian, about how we need to change education and prepare it for the future. And I wanted to get each of your thoughts on that. I mean, in providing an education, not only bringing people up to, basic literacy, but what does it mean to actually prepare students today for jobs that may not yet exist?
It's something I think about all the time. The CEO of Lyft, if you're familiar with Lyft, there's Uber, Lyft, he published a paper about a month ago called The Road Ahead. And in The Road Ahead, he basically says in about 10 years, no one in major cities in New York will need to own their own car. Because if you need to get from A to B, you'll bring your smartphone, you'll tap an address, A car will show up, either it will have a human being in it or not, and it'll get you to where you want to be. The payments will already be processed. And the CEO paints this picture of, think about our society that it's built around cars and parked cars, because cars are actually in motion about 4% of their life. And so most of the time, we have a society that's structured around just making sure cars can be parked. And he's like, think of a reality in which we could have whole parking lots that are now recaptured for environmental space. You know, just thinking about this world. And so we're spending a lot of time, because we're now designing a high school, for what are the kinds of experiences we want to have for our kids that are out of the traditional mode, that they can envision what would this world be like, you know? There are all these studies now which are predicting the number of jobs that are going to be replaced by automated capabilities, by robots. What are all those human beings that are doing these low-wage jobs? What are they going to do? And so we don't have the answer yet, but this is what we're spending a lot of time thinking about, because we don't want technology to be a negative push. We want it actually to be enabling and empowering. And we have to have an education system that prepares kids for that future.
Yeah, and with the juggernaut of technological progress, there are going to be those that are crushed underneath it and those that are driving. I mean, that seems to be the trends thus far. Unless we somehow come to a new moral vision where we talk about sharing in those benefits.
It's hard to see, because most of the people who are developing these new technologies are not necessarily developing it from a moral, equitable perspective. I mean, I shouldn't cast aspersions, but you know, there's
in capitalism, there's a division of responsibility that we all abide by. So how can you? But can we bring those people to account?
Correct. And my hope is that we have some enlightened leadership, particularly people running schools, who recognize that we play a role that's not just babysitting kids to get them to proficiency levels. You know, most of the time when you're reading about education, you're talking about our kids at basic reading levels, as opposed to, are they getting exposure to the rich histories and canon? Do they have a body of knowledge that allows them to know the great works of Shakespeare and Aristotle, and that they can, from a philosophical perspective, know the greatest stories, have a purpose in their life? And then science and history, all these other rich curricula, that's the foundation that's necessary to allow kids to envision a future that's very, very different than whatever the reality is that they may have grown up in.
Jacob, how do you get the kids growing up in?
Something Ian said about we're designing a high school. Because in poor communities anywhere in the world, the more money you have, the bigger box you build. And if you think about the role architecture plays in a privileged setting and design thinking, and how do you lay out a future that you're trying to achieve? And it goes back to, I hate to keep harping on this, of quality. In 2005, we set out to build a building, and everyone said, I said, I want to win International Architecture Awards. And everyone said, oh, that's my vanity project, what's he doing? And people criticized us for spending $7 million on a building. And we won an award at the MoMA for architecture, but it was a statement, right, that these kids, it shouldn't be access to great healthcare and education, right? It should be a child's right, not a privilege. And we needed to do that to sort of break down the barriers of the way people think in our communities. And today, our center is about quality. It's about a robotics program where our kids can compete. We have a high school robotics program, the only one in the townships in South Africa, competing with all these privileged schools around the world. We have a coding and STEM program that's top-notch. We have science programs, but it's about quality. It's about not trying to reach 100,000 kids, but we have 1,800 kids. And can we do that with real quality? Because that's how you level the playing field, and that's how you prepare for whatever these jobs might be, which, like I said, we don't know what's going to happen. And there's a lot of speculation, and in all these different fields, but all I know is the only way to prepare our students is by offering them a truly sort of quality education, and on par with what my kid is getting in Brooklyn or so forth.
And you can't get to 100,000 before you first reach 1,800 in a high quality way, and maybe you learn how can we do this at scale. sometimes I think people are, unfortunately, the need is so significant that you feel like we have to try and solve everything at once, but maybe it's really innovative experimentation with smaller populations where you learn those elements to then figure out how you can serve a larger community.
Raising children is not scalable, right? What worked for you didn't work for you and didn't work for you and didn't. It's so deeply individualized. And that's one of our great challenges, is that people are going to raise children, and technology will assist us in the classrooms, but we need good human beings. And it goes back to funding, because funders say, well, what other program supplies do you need? I'm like, I need coaches, mentors, psychologists, social workers. Right. I need people.
Right.
I don't really, and
we need parents.
At the center of it all.
How are we doing on time? Are we ready to take questions? Huh? Okay, great. Great, yes, let's take some questions. Yes.
Okay, so if I can restate, I think the first question is an iPhone in the hands of a child, will that make them more likely to read Antigone or Socrates? That's the first question. And it sounds like the second question is technology will likely kill jobs as opposed to create jobs. Is that an appropriate restatement? There you go.
I just want to.
There is a third point. There's a third point, which is the technology has created drones, and we kill drones, and we kill today people by pushing a button somewhere in a laboratory, and we kill people in Afghanistan. So the ethical question is out of the window too. Thank you.
So Melvin Kranzberg, the great historian of technologists, made the definitive statement when he said, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. Well, an iPhone does not make a child more likely to read the classics. It does make it easier to access them. They are freely available in the public domain, with video, with translation, with PDF, and it still takes a teacher and a class. Digital resources are not a panacea, and we're hopefully at the end of claiming that they are, but it's also silly to dismiss the idea that these devices can bring us closer and connect us to the past and to the great works of our ancestors.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my answer. Technology itself is neutral. I mean, you just used a microphone to ask a question. If there were a hate-filled speaker using that same microphone, we'd have a much more negative response. And I just think that it's why schools have to play and have to prepare kids to operate in this world, because kids are going to have iPhones, right? Kids are going to have access to the latest devices, whether we like it or not. I think we can't assume that those technologies won't become widely available for very good reasons. I mean, I remember when I actually was in South Africa several years ago in remote villages, and yet there were kids there with phones that were operating, they were connecting to other villages in their communities, they were using remnant time to get medical information on these phones. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this is extraordinary. This is a way to make the world much smaller. But it requires people with foresight to think through, how do we not make these tools that are dumbing down a population, but hopefully